I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Self-Compassion and Psychological Well-Being. I'm Lynn Osborne, Director of Business Development at the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare, and your moderator for today's session. The Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to strengthening the relationship between patients and their clinical caregivers and preserving the human connection in healthcare. Before we begin the formal presentation, let's go over a few details about the webinar. The Schwartz Center Compassion in Action webinar series is funded in part by a donation in memory of Julian and Eunice Cohen. Today's program will be 60 minutes. The first 45 minutes will be presentation, followed by a 10-minute question and answer session. Today's program is being recorded and will be available on the Schwartz Center website a week after the session. Please note that attendees are participating in listening-only mode, but can interact with the speakers and me by using the questions pane, which should be appearing on your screen. If you have questions, please just type them into the questions pane and send them to us, and we'll address as many of them as we can at the end of the formal program. We'll also be polling the audience during this session, and we hope you will participate in this measurement tool. As you exit the webinar, you'll receive an electronic survey that we ask you to take a minute to complete so that we may measure your assessment of today's program. Your feedback is really important to us. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our host for today's session, Dr. Beth Lown. Beth is an Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and the Medical Director of the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Care. Beth?
Thank you, Lynn, and good afternoon, everyone. Self-compassion involves treating ourselves kindly in times of emotional distress, just as we would a close friend we cared about. Rather than making evaluations of ourselves as being good or bad, self-compassion involves understanding ourselves as imperfect humans and learning to be present with the inevitable struggles of life with greater ease. It really motivates us to make the changes we need to make in our lives, not because we're feeling worthless or inadequate, but because we want to lessen our own suffering. So this session will present some theory and research on self-compassion, which a growing empirical literature shows is strongly associated with psychological well-being. And our presenters will also talk about how self-compassion can really be a powerful tool for caregivers, allowing us to really be present for others while avoiding burnout and caregiver fatigue. And then finally, we'll do a brief self-compassion exercise that will be taught by our presenters and that you can actually practice in your everyday life. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. And first is Kristin Neff. And Kristin.
Yes, hello.
Hi, Kristin. I'll introduce you. I'll just tell the audience that you're an Associate Professor of Educational Psychology at University of Texas at Austin, and Kristin's really been a pioneer in this field. She's the one who really conducted the first studies on self-compassion over a decade ago. And I'll just say that in addition to writing a whole bunch of articles and book chapters, she's the author of the book Self-Compassion, The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself. And in conjunction with our other speaker, her colleague, Dr. Chris Germer, she's developed an 8-week training program called Mindful Self-Compassion, and they offer workshops on self-compassion all over the world. Also, you'll be interested to know that Kristin is featured in a book and a documentary called The Horse Boy, which chronicles her family's journey to Mongolia, where they trekked on horseback to find healing for her autistic son. So welcome, Kristin.
Thank you, Beth. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm glad you're with us. So now let me also introduce Chris Germer. Dr. Germer is a clinical psychologist in private practice and a clinical instructor in psychology at Harvard Medical School, a founding faculty member of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, and he too leads workshops internationally on mindfulness and self-compassion, and developed with Kristin the 8-week Mindful Self-Compassion program. Chris also is the author of a book called The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion and co-editor of Mindfulness and Psychotherapy and Wisdom and Compassion in Psychotherapy. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Beth, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Yeah, I think we all are. So why don't you guys just jump right in? Go right ahead.
Well, we're going to be talking about self-compassion, going over some of the research on self-compassion, and then Chris especially is going to be talking about how it's relevant for caregivers. Chris?
Yes, thank you. We will be doing that, and why don't you begin?
Okay, I think we're starting with the polling question, aren't we? That's right.
And here we are. So their first polling question, if our audience could take a look at their screens and find their polling pane and vote on the following question. When you fail, make a mistake, or things go wrong in life, how do you typically treat yourself? Selection 1 is as well as you treat a friend. Worse than you treat a friend is selection 2, and about the same as number 3. So if you could just take a moment and take a look at your screen and fill out your check your polling question 1, 2, or 3. How do you treat yourself when something goes wrong? I'll read the question one more time. When you fail, make a mistake, or things go wrong in life, how do you typically treat yourself? As well as you treat a friend, worse than you treat a friend, or about the same? Okay, we've got some great results here, and we're going to close the poll. The results are on your screen as well as you treat a friend, 10%, worse than you treat a friend, 73%, and about the same, 17%. I wonder, Chris or Kristin, would you like to comment on those results?
Well, I can just say that's about what we find in the research as well. The vast majority of people say they treat others much better than they treat themselves. So this is not unusual.
Okay. Thank you, audience, and now we'll proceed with the presentation.
Okay. So what is self-compassion? Really, if we want to think of a short definition, it involves treating yourself with the same kindness, care, and concern as you treat a close friend. Unfortunately, though, as was shown in that poll, most of us do not treat ourselves as kindly as we treat friends. In fact, actually, if you really think about it, some of us speak to ourselves in a way we probably wouldn't even speak to people we don't like very much. Okay, so what we're doing with self-compassion is we're really learning a different way to be with ourselves, learning a warm, open-hearted way of being with ourselves, especially when we're suffering. When I first started learning about self-compassion, it was my last year of graduate school at UC Berkeley. And I was under a lot of stress. I was trying to finish my PhD, trying to get a job. So I was in Berkeley. I decided, well, what else do you do in Berkeley but learn how to meditate, right? There was like 3 meditation centers just down the street from me. And the very first night I went to the meditation center, the woman talked about the importance of self-compassion, talked about the need for us to be kind to ourselves. And really, it immediately made a difference in my life. I was surprised how quickly my life changed just by giving myself permission to be kind to myself. And then, you know, I did go on to start researching the topic, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I have to say, in some ways, I conducted the research just to prove what I already knew. Self-compassion has gotten me through very hard times over and over again. So to give an example, when my son was diagnosed with autism, I'd already had about 7 years of self-compassion practice under my belt. And thank goodness, because it really helped me. I actually was going to a meditation retreat the day he got diagnosed. And the whole retreat, I just sat there and gave myself compassion and concern and kindness, and I let myself feel whatever I was feeling. Even thoughts I thought I shouldn't be having. And once I opened my heart to myself, I found I could really more easily accept Rowan as well. So over and over in my journey with him and my journey in general, self-compassion really helped. And that's why I'm so passionate about it. But going back to the research, when I first decided to research self-compassion, I knew I had to come up with a clear definition. And so from my point of view, self-compassion is composed of 3 different components, and that is kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So let me just talk about those a bit more in detail. Okay, so kindness, self-kindness versus self-judgment. That's really what we were talking about before, showing ourselves the same care and understanding that we'd show a friend rather than the harsh self-judgment that we usually give toward ourselves. But there's also an action element to self-compassion. It means that when we're suffering, we actively soothe and comfort ourselves, again, just like we would to a friend. Okay. The next element is common humanity versus isolation. And this really involves seeing our experience of imperfection as part of the larger human experience. Now, logically, cognitively, we know that life is imperfect, we know that we're imperfect, and we wouldn't say any differently. But irrationally, emotionally, what happens when life gets difficult is we feel that something has gone wrong, that this shouldn't be happening, that this is somehow abnormal. And it's that feeling that this is abnormal that actually causes us to feel isolated. As if, again, this is all irrational, but it's as if everyone else in the world is living this perfectly happy, normal life, and it's just me who's suffering in that way. So it really adds insult to injury, because not only are we suffering, we also feel all alone in our suffering. So self-compassion, we remember that, wait a second, this is part of the human experience. This is supposed to be happening. This is part of life. And then when we do that, believe it or not, every moment of suffering offers an opportunity for connection. And then the third component of self-compassion is mindfulness. So in order for us to be kind to ourselves, to open our hearts to ourselves when we're suffering, we first have to be able to turn toward that suffering, to notice it, and to be with it as it is. Okay? And mindfulness also is a kind of balanced awareness that neither minimizes nor avoids how difficult things are, but also doesn't run away with an exaggerated storyline of, woe is me. And I call that process over-identification. So mindfulness just allows us to be present with our situation for long enough to where we can recognize common humanity and be kind to ourselves. And there's actually been some research done, especially by a man named Paul Gilbert, trying to understand where both self-criticism, the lack of self-compassion, and self-compassion, where these come from. And they actually have different physiological roots. Okay? Self-criticism is rooted in the threat defense system. This is one of our oldest physiological systems. When there's some threat in the environment, like that picture you see, where if you were a zebra and a lion was chasing you, what would happen is your amygdala would get triggered, you release cortisol and adrenaline, and you get ready for fight or flight. It's a very important system, and it keeps us alive. The problem is the system evolved to protect our bodily selves. And nowadays, typically the threat isn't to our bodily selves, but to our self-concept. So every time we fail, we make a mistake, or we feel inadequate in some way, our self-concept is threatened. And that actually triggers the threat defense system. We release cortisol and adrenaline, and we get ready for fight or flight. Unfortunately, that is actually directed to ourselves because we're the problem. And it's really a double whammy because we are both the attacker and the attacked. Okay, so that's why self-criticism is so painful, why it's linked to things like anxiety and depression, because we just feel under threat all the time. So sometimes this system is referred to as the reptilian brain, right? So we all have this system, but luckily, at least most of us aren't just reptiles, we're also mammals. Okay, so self-compassion is really rooted in the mammalian caregiving system. And this is the system where when we're exposed to things like warmth, gentle touch, and soothing vocalizations, we release oxytocin and opiates, and we feel safe. And the reason this system evolved is because the mammalian young are born very immature, and they needed a system in place that would keep the infant safe and close to the mothers. So what this means is that when we give ourselves warmth, we speak gently to ourselves, and we're really tender with ourselves, we use a kind tone, then we also feel safe, and we feel really like we're being taken care of. And so Chris is actually going to lead us through a practice that really uses these components we've just been talking about to induce a state of self-compassion.
Yes, we'll be activating the mammalian caregiving system by using phrases that correspond to the three components of self-compassion that Kristin mentioned: mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. So this is a 5-minute exercise that you can practice anytime in daily life when you feel under stress. It's called the self-compassion break. So to start, I would like to invite everyone to close your eyes and to think of a problem that you're having in your life right now, such as a relationship problem, a work problem, a health problem, or maybe a loved one that's struggling. So choose one. And really let yourself feel it in your body. And so I said there are 3 phrases. So the first phrase is, this is a moment of suffering. As you think about this problem and your body doesn't feel at ease, this is a moment of suffering. This is a moment of suffering. Other words you can use, such as this hurts, or this is tough, or ouch. That's mindfulness. This is a moment of suffering. Just validating it. The second phrase, suffering is a part of life. Suffering is a part of life. Other phrases that capture this element of common humanity are, other people also feel this way, or I'm not alone, or we all struggle in our lives. So just recognizing you're not alone in this struggle. And now I'd like everyone, if you don't mind, to put your hand, 1 or 2 hands over your heart, or maybe over your belly, or anywhere that it feels soothing. Just take a moment and feel the touch of your hands. And then saying to yourself, may I be kind to myself. May I be kind to myself. May I be kind to myself. That's self-kindness, the third component. And you can use any phrase you like, such as, may I accept myself as I am. May I forgive myself. May I be strong. Some words of kindness. Okay? So the self-compassion break has 3 phrases. Mindfulness, this is a moment of suffering. Common humanity, suffering is a part of life. And finally, self-kindness, may I be kind to myself. And then slowly open your eyes. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Lynn for our final polling questions.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you all for participating. Our polling question number 2 is, what misgivings do you have about self-compassion? Do you have feelings that it's selfish? number 1. It's self-indulgent, number 2. Number 3, it's weak. Number 4, it lowers standards. Number 5, it weakens motivation. If you could open your polling pane and just pick a little choice there, we'd love to have your input on how you feel about what misgivings do you have about self-compassion. Again, 1, it's selfish. It's self-indulgent, number 2. It's weak, number 3. It lowers standards, number 4. Number 5, it weakens motivation. This is an interesting question to ask right after we've just done this nice meditation. Here we go.
It's also, you know, sometimes it's not what you personally think, but sometimes some of your colleagues or people you've told about the idea of self-compassion have these misgivings as well.
Very good. Yes, indeed. Sort of impressions of self-compassion. And we've got a good set of responses now. I think we'll close the poll, and we go to our results. Interestingly, it's selfish, 21%. It's self-indulgent, 46%. Wow. It's weak, 19%. It lowers standards, 13%, and it weakens motivation, 20%. So, Chris, you might want to, Chris or Kristin, would you like to comment on these results?
Well, I'd actually like to, I'll comment about them, and I'd like to comment about them in conjunction with the research, because these are very common misgivings about self-compassion, and luckily we have enough data to show that they aren't really founded in reality. Okay, so if that's all right, I'm going to do that. So research on self-compassion, the first couple articles I published was in 2005. And at that time, there was work on mindfulness, but not much on self-compassion. And the research literature on self-compassion has really, really exploded. Okay, you can see this graph here from 2003, when there was just 2 publications, to now there's, I think, about 300 articles, chapters, and dissertations written on self-compassion. So it's kind of the hip new thing in research, but it's really great because we're getting a lot of empirical evidence on the benefits of self-compassion. And basically, the bottom line, if you want to sum up the entire research field, is that it's strongly linked to well-being. So it's linked to reductions in anxiety, depression, and stress. In fact, there was recently a meta-analysis which pooled together a lot of studies and found a strong effect size of self-compassion being linked to less anxiety, depression, and stress. Also, less negative mind states like rumination. You're less likely to suppress your thoughts, less likely to be perfectionistic or to feel shame. And so at the same time that there's reductions in these negative states, there are also increases in positive states of mind, things like life satisfaction, happiness, feeling more connected to others, feeling more self-confident, optimistic, curious, grateful. Okay? And really, I think, to me, this illustrates the beauty of self-compassion, because what happens when we embrace our suffering with kindness is we help alleviate the suffering. We calm and soothe ourselves. But at the same time, this feeling that holds the suffering, this sense of kindness, connectedness, presence, mindfulness, these are very positive emotions. So it simultaneously reduces the negative and increases the positive. Okay. Probably the most common misgiving about self-compassion is that it is linked to lower motivation, that it's going to undermine our motivation. In fact, a lot of people, they really cling to their inner critic because they think they need it to keep them going in life. Well, in fact, the research shows just the opposite. The research shows that being kind and supportive to ourselves, just like a good coach would be, is actually a lot more effective than cutting ourselves down all the time. So, for instance, it's linked to more motivation, the desire to grow because we're interested in growing, we want to learn. A lot of people think it's going to lower our standards. Well, that's not true at all. Actually, what we find is the standards of self-compassionate people are just as high. The difference is they don't get as upset when they don't meet them. Okay, they're more able to handle failure. And what that means is they have less fear of failure, okay, and that when they do fail, they're more likely to try again and to kind of keep trying even if it's difficult. And this is really important for motivation because we know, don't we, that failure is really the best learning experience. So people who are more self-compassionate, and there's a lot of research to support this, are actually more motivated to reach their goals and motivated in a healthy manner. One of the other things that comes up with misgivings about self-compassion is the idea that somehow it's letting yourself off the hook. You know, if I'm self-compassionate, oh, well, I stole $500. You know, it's only human, right? People have that misconception. Again, the research shows just the opposite. If you're self-compassionate, you're more likely to be conscientious. You're actually more likely to take responsibility for your past mistakes. Because, you know, if you think about it, it's because it's safe to do so. If I know that by admitting I made a mistake, I'm going to feel horrible about myself, I'm going to beat myself up, I'd much rather blame you. Okay, but if it's safe to make mistakes, if it's okay, then I can admit that I've made mistakes. And for that reason, people who are more self-compassionate are actually more likely to apologize when they do make mistakes. Okay, this belief that it's self-indulgent, which for this crowd was actually the most common misgiving. Well, once again, the research is showing just the opposite. Self-compassionate people are more likely to engage in healthy behaviors, things like exercising. Some nice research showing that elderly people in particular are more likely to visit the doctor, use preventative health if they have self-compassion. People are more likely to practice safe sex. They're less likely to drink a lot of alcohol, and self-compassion also helps people quit smoking. And again, this makes sense. Just like a compassionate mother wouldn't indulge her child. She wouldn't let him eat whatever sugar he wants and skip school and stay up all night. A compassionate mother says, you know, eat your vegetables, do your homework, go to school on time. And it's the same with ourselves. If we care about ourselves and we don't want to suffer, we're going to do what it takes to actually be healthy. And in fact, one of the ways research is showing this plays itself out is in issues of body image and eating disorders. Okay, people who are more self-compassionate, who are more able to accept themselves as they are, they're less preoccupied with their bodies, you know, wondering if they look a certain way. They're less ashamed of their bodies. When they blow their diet, they're less likely to binge afterwards. A lot of people, you know, they're trying to lose weight, they blow their diet, they say, oh, well, I'm a failure, or they're upset, so they drown themselves in more food. When people are self-compassionate, they can accept that they've blown their diet, and therefore they can kind of go back to their regular eating patterns. A lot of research shows that it's less linked to less anorexic behaviors, binging behaviors, really all sorts of eating disorders. They're lower in people who have self-compassion. And a recent study just came out showing that people who are more self-compassionate are more likely to listen to their bodies and stop when they're full. The conception that self-compassion is weak. Well, again, we're finding out in the research that self-compassion is one of the greatest strengths we have. It's linked to coping and resilience in all sorts of situations. It's the strongest predictor of resilience in divorce. For vets, it's a predictor, preventative measure for PTSD. It helps people cope with things like AIDS and chronic pain. The idea that somehow self-compassion is selfish, well, that doesn't turn out to be true either. In fact, people who are more self-compassionate, they find that they're more caring and supportive with their partners, with their intimate partners. They're more accepting, they're less controlling, they're less aggressive. And of course, this makes sense because, you know, if you don't expect your partners to have to meet all your needs exactly when and as you want them met, then you really have more to give to your partner. So it's anything but selfish. It actually helps you connect to others. And in fact, if you look to the link between self-compassion and care for others, people who are self-compassionate toward themselves are more likely to forgive others, to take their perspective, and also to help others when they're in need. Okay, so self-compassion is not selfish. Not only does it help people give to others, it also seems to help sustain giving to others. There's a growing literature on the role of self-compassion for caregivers, and we find, perhaps not surprisingly, that self-compassion is linked to less burnout, it's linked to less caregiver fatigue. People who are self-compassionate are more satisfied with their caregiving role. And actually, a manuscript I just sent off, wish me luck, to be published. We did a study of parents of autistic children, something that I know very personally. We found that actually the level of self-compassion parents had was more predictive of how well they were coping with their role than the severity of the autism itself. And we find this over and over again. It's not just what happens to you that counts, it's how you relate to yourself in the midst of your struggles that seems to count the most. In terms of, some of the early influences on self-compassion, we're also finding out a lot more with this, that people who have secure attachment, who have good parenting, who feel positive about themselves, have good expectations for the world, they tend to have more self-compassion. Unfortunately, people with a history of abuse or parents who are very critical, if there was a lot of fighting in the home, they tend to have lower levels of self-compassion. The good news is, though, is we're also finding that people with problematic childhoods, if they learn how to be more self-compassionate, that it actually really helps them heal, and it helps them actually not be as disabled by their early childhood history. So that's a really exciting finding, I think. And it really leads to this question of, can self-compassion be taught? Are we stuck with the levels we were born with, or can we learn this? And I'd like to turn this over to Chris.
Yes, thank you, Kristin. So at this point, actually, most of the research on self-compassion has been correlational, showing really strong associations with many measures of mental and physical health. But what about training, prospective studies? So that research is just beginning. And in a moment, Kristin will share the results of a randomized controlled trial that we did on our 8-week Mindful Self-Compassion training program. But shorter trainings also seem to work, such as writing a compassionate letter to yourself daily for 7 days, or listening to self-compassion meditations 3 to 4 times a week for 3 weeks. They also appear to make a difference. Self-compassion is considered the beating heart of mindfulness training, or the attitude of mindfulness. And so we've also found that 8-week mindfulness trainings, like mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, also seem to increase self-compassion, but perhaps not as much as full-on self-compassion training. Self-compassion is also a key element of the newly emerging mindfulness and acceptance-based therapies. One notable therapeutic approach that focuses on self-compassion is Paul Gilbert's compassion-focused therapy. And this program seeks to activate the mammalian caregiving system that Kristin mentioned earlier. And it's also been shown to be effective for a wide range of psychological disorders, especially shame disorders, which seem to underlie a lot of other disorders, such as anxiety and depression and alcoholism and violence and so forth. But there's even also a randomized controlled study by Christine Brailer that shows that compassion-focused therapy can reduce depression in psychosis. So the program that Kristin and I have been developing for the past 5 years is called Mindful Self-Compassion. It's also an 8-week program, 2.5 hours per week, in addition to a 4-hour retreat. The program is open to anyone. And this program includes meditation, short talks, experiential exercises, group discussion, home practices. And the goal of the program is for participants to have a felt sense of self-compassion, a direct experience of it, and also to learn practices that evoke self-compassion in daily life. And so now Kristin will share some of our research findings on this MSc program. Kristin?
Sorry, okay, here I am. Thank you. Yes, we've published one randomized controlled trial of the program where we compared the outcomes for people who took our program versus people who are on the waiting list to take our program. And we had about 54 participants, so it was a fairly small study. We're hoping to do some more research, but we did get some nice results. Okay, here this graph shows levels of gains in self-compassion, mindfulness, compassion for others, and also life satisfaction. And we find really large increases, especially in self-compassion. That's about a 43% increase, which is very large for this type of research. More mindfulness, more compassion for others, not as much, and that's basically because people came into this program with very high levels of compassion already. So there was a bit of a ceiling effect. They also reduced in negative outcomes, things like less depression, less anxiety, less stress, and less tendency to avoid your negative emotions. So it seemed to really impact the mindset of people after taking this program as they went about their daily lives. And we also followed people up over time. We actually measured how well they were doing right after the program, 6 months after the program, and actually a year after the program. And all well-being gains were maintained. Nothing was lost. In fact, this graph shows self-compassion. But if you look at life satisfaction, it actually significantly increased after a year. And I like to kind of interpret that finding as saying that the more you practice self-compassion, the more it's going to make your life meaningful and more satisfying. There was also an impact of how often people practice self-compassion on how much self-compassion they gained. What was kind of interesting, it actually surprised me a little bit, is that, first of all, the days people meditated per week using the self-compassion meditations we teach, that predicted how much people gained. But also the informal practices, just like the one Chris led you through, that was equally predictive of how much well-being was gained. And the reason I think that's important is, you know, let's face it, not everyone has time to meditate, not everyone wants to meditate. So just really learning to be kinder to yourself, to speak to yourself more kindly, and to care and soothe and comfort yourself when you're feeling suffering seems to really make a difference. And of course, this is very important for the people listening to this webinar because caregivers really need self-compassion. And I'd actually like to hand this over to Chris to talk about how it's relevant for caregivers.
Yes, thank you. So self-compassion is uniquely helpful for caregivers, those who care for patients, children, elders, or anyone really who needs our help for extended periods of time. Probably everyone on the webinar knows about compassion fatigue or burnout. You know, symptoms include disturbed sleep, avoiding thoughts and feelings associated with work or with caregiving, distress, intrusive thoughts, also our attention wandering away from people we're supposed to be caring for. We often become irritated or angry, sometimes even hateful toward those we're caring for. So that's compassion fatigue. Or caregiver fatigue. But one thing we should know is that caregiver fatigue isn't a weakness. It's actually a sign of being human. The human brain is highly social, and we seem to have neurons dedicated to perceiving in our own bodies what others are experiencing. they're called mirror neurons. But we also have other areas in the brain dedicated to evaluating social situations, such as the default mode network right down the middle of the brain and the temporoparietal juncture right above the ear on the right above the ear. And together we can feel what others feel, literally. We can feel it. When others are in pain, we feel that pain in our own bodies as real pain. And if the pain is severe enough, we develop vicarious traumatization or secondary traumatization. That's precisely what compassion fatigue is. It's like a lot like post-traumatic stress disorder, characterized by hyperarousal, avoidance, re-experiencing. But the more we resist or avoid the pain, the more exhausted we become. So we're usually told that the best way to alleviate compassion fatigue is to have firmer boundaries between ourselves and those we're caring for. We are also advised to take better care of ourselves, such as exercise, attending workshops, working less, getting supervision, delegating responsibility, spending time with friends. But what's the limitation of these strategies? They are important. Self-care strategies are important, but they're often motivated by self-kindness, but they tend to happen off the job. They don't help us in the midst of caregiving interactions. And also, their strategies which involve boundaries might help us to make us feel disconnected from those that we're caring for. So, enter compassion. Compassion is a way of being with empathic pain without fighting it and becoming exhausted. We all know nurses who seem to be naturally good at that. Their heart is open and they're just full of love even when people are suffering. So what is compassion? Compassion is empathy, which is feeling another person's world as our own. Empathy plus love. So Tanya Singer, a neuropsychologist, and colleagues have found that on fMRI scans of the brain that compassion activates pleasure centers in the brain, such as the striatum, at the same time as we experience the suffering of others. So compassion is actually a positive emotion. We feel good even in the midst of suffering. So hence, Tanya Singer and her colleague, the monk Mathieu Ricard, said that actually compassion fatigue is a misnomer. It's really empathy fatigue. So compassion allows us to be in the presence of suffering with an open heart. There's a physician, Michael Kearney, who wrote in the Journal of the American Medical Association 2009, physicians with burnout who use self-care without self-awareness, and here he implies also self-compassion, may feel as though they're drowning and barely able to come up for air, whereas self-care with self-awareness and self-compassion is like learning to breathe underwater. So what this means is we can stay in the game with self-awareness and self-compassion. We can continue caregiving while caring for ourselves. Self-compassion provides emotional resources needed to care for others. Everyone who's ever flown an airplane has probably heard, if there's a drop in cabin pressure, the oxygen mask will automatically drop down. Please take your mask, put it firmly over your face before helping others. So in this self-compassion training program, we teach people that we teach them how to practice self-compassion even while they're engaged in caregiving. For example, we teach a meditation called Giving and Receiving Compassion, where basically when you breathe in for yourself and you breathe out for the other person. In for yourself and out for the other person while you're caregiving. Some people have dubbed this one for me, one for you, or loving ourselves while loving others. Anyhow, you can try it out for yourself. And you can even breathe in for yourself and out for others when you think about someone you're caring for who stresses you out. Yes, because we're so empathically connected with others, our calm mind state does impact the mind state of those we care about. Our mind states are contagious. And so sometimes the best way we can care for others is by finding our way home to our own loving center. So now I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Lown.
Wait, can I actually tell a little story, Chris? I think there's time to really,
Sure.
because I've seen this play out in my own life over and over again. You know, like I said earlier, self-compassion really, really helped me deal with Rowan's autism. And what I found is, so just to tell a little story, one time I was actually on a plane with a transatlantic flight, and right, you know, that moment when the lights went down and everyone was trying to get to sleep, Rowan decided to throw like a horrific tantrum. I had no idea why. Everyone, you know, was disturbed. They were looking at us. So I thought, oh, goodness, what am I going to do? Well, you know, maybe I'll take him to the bathroom, muffle his cries. Of course, that didn't work because the bathroom was occupied. And so here Rowan and I were in that little hallway outside the bathroom, and he was screaming and tantruming. And I knew that I had no other option but to give myself compassion. I kind of surrendered, but I opened my heart to myself. And what I found was, believe it or not, instead of just being with the anxiety and stress of the tantrum and what was happening, I was actually able to rest in the love and sense of connectedness and presence that was holding my own suffering. So I was making sure Rowan was okay, of course, but most of my attention was turned toward myself and giving myself what I needed. And then what I found, and I found this over and over again, that as soon as I give myself compassion and my mind state comes down and I feel soothed, I feel safe, Rowan immediately responds, right? So if I feel annoyed or scared, he feels weak. It kind of increases his distress mood. But if I can calm and soothe myself, it helps him feel calm and soothed. So just again to make the point that self-compassion is not selfish at all. The more we give ourselves what we need, the more we care for ourselves, the more other people we're in contact with pick up on that and also feel in a calmer, more open-hearted state of mind. Sorry, I just wanted to tell that story.
Oh, that's a great story, Kristin. I never tire of hearing it. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that one. Yeah, so now we should probably turn the program over to Dr. Lown.
Yeah, no, I was just going to thank both of you. I love that story, Kristin, and you know, it strikes me that that's yet another example of this emotional resonance through the mirror neuron system or other kinds of systems in our brain that just act without our conscious awareness very often. So I wanted to ask a question because there are such societal sort of standards, or maybe I don't mean to stereotype all of us who live in this country, but when I think of some of the cultural symbols, you know, the Lone Ranger and all of these kinds of things, our society seems to be characterized and value people who are independent, who are individualistic, and who may or may not be judgmental when they compare themselves or other people with societal standards. And I think this is especially true for health professionals. And it's so countercultural to think of being self-accepting, feeling that oneself is part of a larger humanity. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on some of the more powerful ways, actually, to start to really shift this societal mindset that values individualistic, highly independent, forward-moving action people.
Do you want me to take that, Chris? Or? Yeah, okay. Well, it is true. In our culture, you might say self-esteem is God. Be number one, right? We all have to be special and above average. That's the way we like to think. But there are just so many huge downsides to that. Constant social comparison. You know, we feel good when we succeed, but when we fail, you know, our self-esteem deserts us and we feel horrible. So I really do think there is starting to be a culture shift. I'm actually really encouraged. I get Google alerts on articles and blogs on self-compassion, and they increase all the time. It seems to be slowly entering the common culture, the idea that we can be a good friend to ourselves. I think it's really following how we've changed our parenting style. You know, most people in society used to believe spare the rod, spoil the child. And people now kind of realize that being more nurturing, being more encouraging is going to get better results. And I think that's starting to happen with the idea of self-compassion versus self-criticism as well. And I also think people are starting to ask the question, you know, what really makes me happy? Is it feeling I'm better than others? Is it having that fancy car, having that fancy house? Or is it really being, you know, my heart open? We have a colleague, Michelle Becker, who works with us, who likes to describe the three components of self-compassion as having a sense of loving, connected presence. You know, and isn't that really what we want, having loving, connected presence? And I think more and more people are starting to take on that point of view. So, you know, we'll see. But I really actually have a lot of hope that things are starting to change.
That's encouraging. Thank you. Lynn, have there been other questions that have been posed by our listeners?
Yes, there are, Beth. Thanks so much. We have a number of questions. And before we begin, I just want to remind our audience to type their questions into the question pane. The first one I'd like to ask is, why are we surprised by suffering? Has there been a shift in worldview?
Chris, do you want to take that one, or?
Oh goodness, I don't even know where to begin on that. In our culture, we do tend to be surprised by suffering. I know in Poland, for example, when you say hi, how are you? If you say great, it's actually considered socially inappropriate. You know, you start to talk a little bit about some of the difficulties that you're going through in order to connect. So I do think in our culture we are surprised with suffering. My guess is that in our culture it's because suffering is somehow associated with shame, or, you know, failure and shame. But perhaps Kristin has some reflection on that as well.
Well, I mean, I think really in American culture in particular, where we're all about positive thinking and being special and above average, we do have this, and again, it's not logical, but this sense that we should be perfect. We should have everything go well. That, you know, things should be going swimmingly, shouldn't they? And that when they don't, something has gone wrong. And I'm not sure why exactly that's the case. Maybe movies, maybe media, maybe just our life is pretty good here and we've come to expect the good. But again, just to point out how really damaging that is, because we are imperfect and things do go wrong, and that is normal. So if we don't expect suffering, then we're going to feel something has gone wrong. We feel isolated and cut off from the rest of humanity. So, yeah, I don't really have an answer for why that's there, but I completely agree that it is there. So we're going to have to wake up at some point.
So thank you very much. Another question is, can you speak to secondary traumatic stress?
Chris, why don't you take that one?
And the effects of it.
And the effects of secondary traumatic stress. Well, you know, as I mentioned, secondary traumatic stress is a lot like, you know, post-traumatic stress when we experience stress directly, and that includes hyperarousal, you know, disturbed sleep, irritability, avoidance, which is avoiding thought and feelings associated with the situation, and also re-experiencing of distress, intrusive thoughts or dreams, and so forth. But what I think is the important thing to remember when it comes to self-compassion is that actually self-compassion enables us to avoid traumatic, difficult experiences less, and the less we avoid, the shorter is the time that we suffer. In contrast, the more we resist or avoid a difficult internal experience, the longer it goes on. In other words, what we say, what we resist persists, and what we can feel, we can heal. So self-compassion is a way of comforting and soothing ourselves when we suffer from trauma, either direct trauma or secondary traumatic stress, because it's what we call a resource. It's a capacity or a skill. It allows us to be with without multiplying our suffering through resistance and avoidance. It allows us to expose ourselves as sort of a natural global desensitization process when we feel we have the capacity to meet suffering.
Excellent, Chris. Thank you. And we've got 5 minutes where it's time for one more question. Having an open heart to suffering and to people who suffer seems to cross domains with religion. Can you please comment on that?
I'm happy to comment on that. Does it cross domains with religion? Well, I'd say it certainly crosses domains with spirituality. Religion is a very complicated topic, and some of it's about spirituality, some of it's about things other than spirituality. But I really think if you look at all the spiritual traditions, the idea of self-compassion is in there. So for instance, Christianity, people might think, oh, well, it's all about sin and I'm a sinner. But what about the idea of Jesus in your heart, right? If you accept Jesus in your heart, then it's an amazing source of compassion that you have access to. In Islam, they talk very much about compassion. In Buddhism, which is kind of where I learned about self-compassion, you know, it's really key to the practice. So spirituality really is about seeing something bigger than ourselves, seeing either a creator, God, or just really interconnectedness. And so in a way, how can spirituality lead to anything else in the idea that what we value is loving, connected presence? So, you know, I would agree, although religion, you know, sometimes that's more about rules than about spirituality, so not so sure about that one.
Well, and I thank you for making that distinction because I think that's a very insightful. And I think we're just about out of time. I'd like to thank Drs. Lown, Neff, and Germer, and Beth, Chris, and Kristin for sharing your expertise and insights with us, as well as everyone in the audience for setting aside time in your busy day to participate in our program. We hope that you'll join us for upcoming programs in the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Care webinar series, including the next one in January, Navigating Discussions of Prognosis, Balancing Hope and Honesty, on January 13th. You can visit our website to find out more at www.theschwartzcenter.org. We also have a call to action, which is called Commit to Compassion. To foster a more compassionate healthcare system, we're calling on all who believe in the importance of compassion and compassionate healthcare to support and endorse the following set of commitments, which you'll see. And we know how busy you are, and we very much appreciate your taking a moment to complete the electronic survey when you exit today's program, because we would value your input for future programs. Beth, would you like to comment?
Well, I just want to say thank you to both Kristin and Chris. And I think the whole concept of self-acceptance, self-compassion really fosters acceptance, compassion, connectedness with others. And that kind of spirit, I think, would probably go a long way in making our whole world a more peaceful, just, equitable, and better place to live. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us and some exercises that we can take home and practice.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank
you.
you.
It was a pleasure.
You're most welcome.
Thank you all, and we will see you at the next Compassion in Action webinar. Thank you so much.